Coming up on Over a Barrel, prices are spiking across the Midwest and the EPA has issued a waiver emergency. Over a Barrel starts right now. Welcome to Over a Barrel. I'm your co-host, Matt McClain. Directly below me, that's the other guy, Patrick DeHaan. Patrick, how are you doing, sir?
I'm great. I'm real excited that we have a special guest today. This is going to be a great episode. Everyone should tune in. There's a lot of these in the weeds conversations for those that like to figure out what is behind a lot of what's going on at the pump. We are going to turn to our guest. Matt, why don't you introduce him?
Yeah, George Hoekstra, actually. And George is also in Chicago. Boy, you Chicago boys, let me tell you, you guys just kind of hang out around. And I'm the only guy that's not in Chicago right now. So, George, who are you with? Talk to us a little bit about everything. And, let's talk a little bit about who you are. Let the people get to know you a little bit.
Okay, well, great to meet you guys. I'm a chemical engineer, and I worked for 25 years for Amoco, which is familiar probably to you guys, maybe not some newer people.
Crystal Clear.
Crystal Clear Ultimate.
Yep.
Yeah, I worked 25 years with Amoco, and then in 1999, BP bought Amoco. And then I worked 10 years with BP, essentially the same company. We had 16 refineries at that time. And after 35 years, it was time for me to retire, and I was still young enough. I had at least 10 good years in me. So I started a company that does research in the same kind of fields that I worked in, which is mainly about refinery technology, refinery economics, fuels, and optimization of, a refinery and its products to maximize profitability.
Well, and that's terrific, by the way. If anyone wants to connect with George, he's on Twitter, Big Shorty George. We'll ask you about that, George, here in just a minute. Or on LinkedIn, George Hoekstra, you can find him Hoekstra Trading. So thanks for coming in. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about that Twitter handle, Big Shorty George?
Well, Patrick and I were just talking about our Dutch heritage. And we both have Dutch names. Some of you may recognize that. But I grew up in a Dutch community, and we had a little group that we were Mike Royko fans. Some of you may remember Mike Royko. But anyway, we kind of had a little clan that referred to Mike Royko's characters that he wrote about. And each one of us had a bit of a name. And he would talk about the syndicate quite a lot. So it turns out that my name in that little pretend clan of high schoolers was Big Shorty. So that was the only real nickname I had that almost everyone knew. Otherwise, they just called me George.
That's awesome. So anyone can connect with you. And I would encourage folks to follow George. He's got a lot of really intricate details, obviously being a chemical engineer. That's real fascinating. And I'm going to guess there's, there were a couple refineries to your point. I'm obsessed with the largest one in the Midwest that oftentimes, if you hear us talking about gas prices, a lot of this, much more, George, than probably the start of your career as we talk about refineries, right? Maybe 30, 40 years ago, refineries were kind of the magic behind gasoline, but it's probably something that now more than ever, that R word is mentioned whenever you see gas prices doing something that they don't normally do. Oftentimes, it's really the first thing that a lot of us talk about. And here we are, very timely that we have you on as a guest. A lot of us have been witnessing big price spikes here in the last couple of weeks. The ExxonMobil refinery, due to a power outage a couple of weeks ago, lost power completely. And that's the current climate that we're in. Gas prices are spiking throughout the Great Lakes. And sorry to the listeners out in the West Coast, usually it's California that sees these really big spikes, but really right now it's the Great Lakes. And just this morning, interestingly enough, we have the EPA issued fuel waivers here. For those of you that don't know, fuel waivers, there's a lot of requirements. George will ask you about some of these requirements here in the next couple of minutes, but the EPA just issued fuel waivers for much of the Great Lakes, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So, George, my question to you on these fuel waivers, for those that don't know, what are these waivers and how do they help improve the situation?
Well, you guys have covered quite well, I think, the fact that it's much more difficult to make gasoline in the summertime than in the winter. And also, there's a lot more regional variation in the, even local variation in the specifications for gasoline. And so it's just a much more difficult thing to supply the gasoline that's demanded by the market in the summer than in the winter. And we can talk more about why that is. But given that situation, you have a real tightness in the octane balance, especially the octane balance, in order to keep supply where it needs to be while meeting all of the specifications. And so waivers relax some of those specifications and get to where you have a lot more flexibility to be able to supply gasoline to the affected markets. And it also makes it easier for any refinery to make more gasoline barrels. Okay. So it's kind of like, if you have you guys have talked about this, if you have a sort of single commodity, it's a lot easier to operate and lower cost to operate than if you have a whole mix of boutique products. And that's like the difference between winter and summer when it comes to gasoline. The waivers basically relieve constraints that are very problematic for a region that's suffering from downtime.
So essentially what the EPA and what, politicians that are asking for these waivers, by the way, politicians from both sides of the aisle here throughout the Midwest are asking for these waivers. Basically, when these waivers are approved, they're basically looking to improve the situation by loosening those tight requirements and making it much more simple for a gallon of gasoline that's produced in one area to be used in another. Is that fair?
That's right, Patrick. And a consequence of that is that the prices don't spike as high as they would without the waiver.
And obviously prices are spiking right now, really, especially in the upper Midwest. I know as what you're talking about there. And, Patrick and George, talk to us a little bit about, how much higher do you all think things are going to go for those who are watching or listening? And do you think that the emergency waiver that you're talking about when it comes to all of this will actually help the situation at all?
Well, my take on that is that the price spiked, I think, about 65 cents in response to the Joliet shutdown during a tornado, July 15. And that has probably hit its peak and on its way down. However, there's now a question about it's a Synovus refinery in Lima, Ohio, that had some kind of unit shutdown. That's about all we know right now. But that doesn't sound good. So I think that if Synovus is a refinery that supplies a lot of ultra low sulfur gasoline, and it is one that I happen to know its production would be affected significantly. Its production of low sulfur gasoline would be affected with a significant outage. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a second spike if there is something serious that's happened at Lima.
And to George's point here, a lot of the way we look at the situation, there's a lot of different markets, right? People see and they hear about futures. A lot of folks don't know that there's a spot market, which is different, which is kind of on the spot. Gasoline is very much a just-in-time commodity. And so oil can trade months out, but there's also gasoline spot markets and spot prices for people that need things here and now. A lot of this analysis, a lot of these refinery outages show up in the spot market where people aren't maybe looking. That is, people will look at the futures price of oil and say, there's no spike. What's going on? Well, a lot of that is because it's influenced not in the future months. That is, probably a month from now, there's not going to be any refinery issues. So a lot of those problems don't show up in those futures prices. But analysts like myself and George look at the spot market, and that's what tells us alarm bells are going off, something happened. And in this case, as George mentioned, we have a couple different refineries now that are having issues. Synovus has 2 refineries in Ohio, one in Toledo, actually in Oregon, Ohio, and another in Lima. And they've been having problems at both. Now, one was just related, I believe, to the CrowdStrike issue, and that one was very brief. But in the midst of the summer driving season, when you have all these regional blends, as George said, boutique blends that are different, you can get caught up when a refinery that supplies one blend or a different blend goes down. It can wreak havoc. And that's a lot of the reason why the EPA will issue these waivers to have commonality now in these areas, meaning it doesn't really matter what kind of gasoline, as long as it's on spec, can be used, whether it's Chicago. And the interesting thing here, George, was that these EPA waivers also cover reformulated gasoline that would really impact Northwest Indiana, Chicago up to Milwaukee, because those areas also have to use a cleaner blend of gasoline in the summer, which brings me to another thing that we've been seeing here in the Great Lakes the last couple of weeks, and also something applicable probably to most of the listeners and viewers out there, is we've noticed a bigger difference between gasoline and premium in the last couple of years. 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, when I had a car that needed premium, I might have paid 20 or 30 cents more for premium. Yeah. It used to be 10 cents for each grade. And now, just in the last week or so, we've noticed that, at least here in the Great Lakes, that gap has jumped in some cases to 60 cents. It used to be 10, then it was 20, 25, 30, then 50, and now a 60-cent a gallon difference. So maybe, George, you can talk about what is behind some of that widening spread between the price of regular and premium gasoline, and why does that seem to vary based on region? Like in California, they're still only paying 30 cents more for premium, or 40 cents, and here in the Great Lakes, it's like $1.20 more for premium.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And actually, that trend in the difference between pump prices, premium and regular, that difference has been going up steadily since 2012. But it was slow at first, and then it accelerated, and it's been relentless. It used to be, for most of history before the year 2000, it was under 20 cents a gallon. And the U.S. average, last I looked, which was only a month ago, it was 88 cents a gallon. So it's huge. In Chicago, it's hard to find premium gasoline that isn't priced $1 more than 87 octane regular. Now, what's behind it? There's been a lot of work on that that's not been highly publicized. But one of the things is that some owner's manuals still say that you should use premium gasoline, and most of those owners follow that. There's less price sensitivity among premium buyers than there is among regular gasoline buyers. So some premium buyers don't even know that they're paying $1 a gallon more. They just pump it in. And a big part of it is that the cost of octane has gone up. And we can talk more about that. That's a little bit more detailed discussion, because what do you mean by the cost of octane? It's kind of hard to get your arms around that, but it's
given me a lot of questions in the back of my mind.
And for those that may not even realize it, right, because octane is something, those are the big buttons that you see labeled with 87, 89, 91, 92, 93. Those are not years that gasoline was invented. Those are octane numbers. And most of us probably shove 87 octane in, although, and George, I'm sure you have thoughts on this too, is that you go out, some regions in the West have octane as low as 85 or 85.5. So all of that is to what George is talking about. You and I just push the buttons. We know that as regular gasoline, but those are octane ratings. And to George's point, your car may require 87, or a lot of newer vehicles in the last 10 years, because of the CAFE standards now, require premium. I know my motorcycle requires 90 octane, which is not even, it's like, okay, that's between 89 and 91. That drives me mad. But that also brings up an interesting thing, that I can buy a tank of 93, get it down to about 2 gallons, and then put 87 in. And that way I net basically that 90 octane.
That works. Yeah. Yeah. And another factor is that with the CAFE standards, which are fuel economy standards that Patrick mentioned, a lot of vehicles went to turbocharging, and turbocharged vehicles require higher octane in order to get the performance that you get out of a different vehicle. So there was an increase in octane demand that came about from the fuel economy standards and the growth of turbocharged engines. The cost part of octane, let me just say, to kind of broad brush that topic, is if you have a barrel of gasoline that's 84 octane, it's not good for much until you blend it with something that brings it up to at least 85 or 85.5, or in Chicago, 87, okay? And there's different ways that you can do that, but the cost of being able to And let me just say, let's say you have I'm going to go one more level deeper. You have 84 octane gasoline. You can bring its octane up to 87. Okay. Or suppose you have an 86 octane barrel. You can bring it up to 87. Now you can bring 86 barrels up to 87 with the same amount of octane that it takes to bring one barrel of 84 up to 87. And that's what we refer to as an octane barrel. That is, the amount of octane depends on the octane boost that you're going to give the fuel and the volume that you have to boost. And that is the commodity that there's a shortage of in the US. And we talk about a lot refining capacity. You guys talk about refining capacity because crude is virtually worthless until you refine it into something useful. So we're very interested in how much crude we can refine. But there's another question in terms of capacity, which is how much good marketable gasoline can you produce?
Yeah.
And that depends on octane barrels. So if you can produce a whole lot of low octane gasoline, it doesn't matter unless you add octane to it.
And now, interesting question to you, George, too, is ethanol is one of those that pulls up octane ratings. So a lot of folks I've noticed on social are saying, why, when I go to the pump, if I find non-ethanol, why is it so much more expensive? And why is the octane lower? Keep in mind that most of the barrels, right, most of the gasoline that Americans are buying has up to 10% ethanol, and that adds to octane as well. And, a lot of folks are saying, I've never seen 84. Generally, and George may speak on this more, refineries don't have to produce that 87, right? They can produce what's called a sub-octane barrel. Then they bring it up with ethanol, or they bring it all the way up to 91 with different octane boosters like alkylate, or go into that more, George, if you would.
Yeah, that's exactly right. What happens today, overall, we need a gasoline pool in the U.S. that's 89 octane on average. Okay, that counts premium and everything else. It has to be 89 octane. Refineries produce a gasoline that's 84 octane. That's what the refineries produce. And then you add ethanol to it, and that boosts it up to 87 because ethanol is an octane additive. So right now we get 3 of the 87 octane from ethanol and 84 from the refinery. And the same thing on the premium side. The refineries will make a sub-octane premium, and when it is blended with ethanol, that brings it up to 91. So we've gone to a situation. There was a time in the late 1980s when refineries were producing 89 octane, and that's what the pool demanded. And what has happened in recent years is the demands on the refinery octane have actually gone down because ethanol is filling the gap. So ethanol is a good thing for octane in the sense that it has allowed the refineries to power down the octane of what they produce. Now, what the refineries produce in the absence of ethanol is not marketable in itself unless it's blended with ethanol. And when you talk about, let's say, 87 octane gasoline that contains no ethanol, that's a special product that the refinery produced at 87 octane instead of their usual production of the sub-octane. They call them BOBs, which means blend stock for oxygenate blending. If you ever hear the term BOB, that's a sub-octane product produced by the refinery that's set at its octane level so that when you put the ethanol in it, it'll bring it up to what it needs to be at the pump. That's how it works.
Kind of interesting, George, you mentioned all this, and I have data here just the last 2 years. There's been such a paradigm shift, a lot of it cafe, that, and the other thing is that demand for these premium gallons, just here in the last 2 years, you'll notice that, about 80% or 77% of what Americans buy was regular. But even since the start of 2022, premium, according to Gas Buddy data, now accounts for over 1 in 5 gallons. And 20 years ago, it was nowhere near that. So a lot of these newer vehicles, and by the way, I wanted to throw in a shout out. George mentioned turbocharging. Forced induction is why a lot of additional octane is needed, because cars like the brand new Chevy Corvette, by the way, turbocharge. Have you seen over 1,000 horsepower now, the brand new 2025 Chevy Corvette? And a lot of it is because now it is twin turboed. Now, Chevy used to be a big supercharged company, meaning that they would throw something on like superchargers, which need additional octane. Turbochargers are almost more infinite in that they can shove more and more air into the engine, but you need more and more octane the more you do that. And, George, I don't know if anyone tracks the price of race fuel, but the price of race fuel, 100 octane, I think there was a station out in Washington that actually had a problem because they were going to charge more than $10 a gallon, but they couldn't get more than $10 on their pump. Really interesting conundrum to be in.
Yeah. Testing the constraints there of your hardware.
Yeah, absolutely. Now it kind of segues into another conversation. We talk about byproducts and gasoline and ways to raise the octane. One other thing that we've been hearing a lot on this program, the Over a Barrel podcast, is that there's this myth that diesel's a byproduct of producing gasoline. Maybe 30 years ago, diesel was really sooty. It was really dirty. Talk to us about how that's changed. A lot of people have been wondering why the price of diesel is almost always now more than gasoline. Any comment? If you could break down that for us, we'd love it.
Well, gasoline and diesel both went through a period in the 90s where the sulfur was dramatically reduced. For example, in gasoline, it went down from sulfur in gasoline went down from over 500 parts per million to where it is 10 parts per million now. Okay. And the same with diesel, to the point where we got ultra low sulfur diesel, which is, I think, 15 ppm now. And that used to be way, way higher in sulfur. And you guys might still be old enough to remember the days when a 18-wheeler would accelerate and you see all this black soot coming out, the particulates in that. You don't see that anymore. If you look, you'll see that doesn't happen. It's very rare anymore. And that's all because of the improvements in the quality of diesel and gasoline that were implemented in the 1990s and the year 2000. There were more stages of that improvement, especially for gasoline. And even today, we're still working on it because the 10 ppm sulfur in gasoline only took effect in 2021, really. So what I was saying is this continual process of having to improve the quality applies to both diesel and to gasoline. Now, diesel, in recent years, actually, most refineries have been trying to increase the yield of diesel. By yield, we say how much of it you get out of a barrel of crude. And diesel volume has grown, and its quality has improved. And it kind of shifts back and forth as to whether a refinery wants to produce more diesel or more gasoline, and it depends on what the margins are for the two. And refineries have the capability to shift that to optimize their product mix. So I think I want to just take one step back, and I'll quickly do this. I'm going to ask a question that only a gasoline nerd would know, and I'd be really, really impressed if even Patrick knows this one. Is what was the octane of gasoline produced by refineries in 1960?
Oh boy, I'm going to guess it was probably higher on average than it is today.
Well, it's kind of a trick question because the actual octane at the pump was the same, exactly the same. It's been 89 octane since 1960, but the gasoline that refineries produced was 78 octane.
Oh boy.
So,
are you talking about the days of lead to bring up the octane? Okay,
exactly. So in 1960, 11 octane was being provided by tetraethyl lead, which was a bad additive. And then we got to the point where in the 80s, all the lead was out of our gasoline, and that's what we call the unleaded era. And the way that was done was by investing a whole lot of money in refineries to change the composition of the refinery-produced gasoline. Okay, so you alter a lot of the chemistry in the refinery, and that was a lot of capital investment and the kind of the glory days of refining technology. Where all that was done, the lead got out of it, and all of the octane was then being provided just by refinery-produced gasoline. And it stayed that way, really, until we got to the point where the government started mandating use of renewables. And that's when ethanol and other oxygenates got into the picture. But ethanol is the one that really took hold. And that's the point I was talking about earlier, where the refineries were able to back off on their octane of what they produce. So we were at the point where lead was providing 11 octane to our 89 octane pool.
Okay.
Now we're at the point where ethanol is providing 3. And in between, we were at the point where there was no additive that was doing that. Okay, so that's kind of the history. And all through that whole thing was a constant demand on refineries to keep changing, improving, and cleaning up the gasoline that they produce, so that we don't any longer have black soot coming out of 18-wheelers, and we no longer have smog and ozone, which was a horrible problem. And even in the 1980s, it was a horrible problem. All that got cleaned up over a period of decades. And now refineries still have to keep improving their product through investment and technology and optimization in order to meet the continually changing specifications and this thing we're talking about boutique fuels.
And these improvements are not cheap, right? Desulfurization is incredibly expensive. So in the backdrop, you and I go to the pump to fill our tanks up. We have no idea that the difference is, a lot of this emissions equipment has forced out smaller refineries, correct, that couldn't afford to keep up with a lot of these retrofits. These are not cheap investments. This is not just, a very short order thing. A lot of these emissions controls, not that they're bad, but they are incredibly expensive. And that's correct. Is that part of the reason behind the declining number of refineries?
I mean, when you talk with people about refineries, you'll hear about alkylation, and you'll hear about reforming, and you'll hear about catalytic cracking and coking and hydroprocessing. Those are all chemical processes where they change the chemistry of the oil that were implemented in order to first get the lead out and then to clean up and get all the sulfur out. And these are billions of dollars of investment. And so the whole era through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and still extending in today. I mean, a refinery, you can look at the Whiting refinery, okay? Think what it looked like 20 years ago. It doesn't look a whole lot different, but it would be pretty much useless today if it was still doing what it was doing in the 1990s. And I have said, basically, any refiner that stands still on its ability to keep up with fuel specifications for 5 years is going to be in trouble competitively. And that's where we stand today. We have a few refineries that can produce almost as much diesel or gasoline as they need to out of almost any crude oil. There's a couple like that.
So I've got a couple of questions for you,
Yeah.
George. Number one, Patrick has made the comment multiple times about home heating oil being essentially the same thing as diesel. So in all of these extra refinery attributes that have kind of been applied to diesel, is that something that is also carried over into the home heating oil? In other words, is it now cleaner to burn home heating oil just like as what it's going into an 18-wheeler going down the road?
Yes, sure. The home heating oil is much, much cleaner burning material than it was before we went to what you call ULSD, means ultra low sulfur diesel. Refineries don't produce the kind of ultra low sulfur diesel that used to cause black smoke coming out of the stacks. They don't do that anymore. Not in the US.
So if I can jump in, Matt, with another question then. So, I use premium. As I mentioned, my motorcycles require premium. What would you imagine, refineries eventually jumping at the bit? Because, premium is fetching at the wholesale level a lot more than regular gasoline. Would you think that would incentivize a refiner or, some sort of third party to come in and create more alkylate or increase capacity for premium? And do you think that takes time? And what does that look like? What kind of investment needs to be made to increase the yield of higher octane fuels?
Well, there are a couple of key processes that will do that. Alkylation is one that will enable you to increase the octane of an existing barrel. Hydroprocessing processes are important, are very important for that purpose, and more investment in certain types of hydroprocessing units can get a refinery out of the bottom tier in terms of its ability to make these modern fuels and move it right up to near the best in the industry. I personally, there's a lot of those type of investments. And one thing that's really very interesting topic is that this huge bull market in octane that we were talking about, that you can see at the pump, that occurred over a period of time when everybody was bearish on gasoline and octane. And even today, if you listen to earnings conference calls, which I was just doing today for some refining companies, and I ask them all the time, do you have any appetite to invest in processes that will help you make more modern gasoline? It's thumbs down.
And now, did you have any reason to speculate why that might be?
Well, I think there's two main reasons. One is during the time that ethanol started providing octane, the refineries' utilization of their octane producing facilities was going down because it was being picked up by ethanol. And so they were saying, well, we have excess octane capacity, which they did because of ethanol replacing some of it. But that's no longer true. That's no longer true. And the other reason, I think, is just sentiment and politics and presumption and attitude that the gasoline market is going to go away. Mm-hmm. And people have told me nobody with half a brain would invest money in gasoline. And I think when they say that, they're talking more about the sentiment about it and the attitudes that gasoline is a product of the past. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so a lot of them deferred and never did make the investments they really needed to make in order to make tier 3 gasoline. And gasoline prices are higher today. That's the 10 ppm gasoline sulfur specification. It came down from 30, and starting in 2021, they needed to make 10. Some refineries invested for that, and many didn't. And I think the reason they didn't is because the outlook for gasoline, according to everybody, was anybody with half a brain wouldn't invest in that product.
In decline.
In decline, right. Yeah. So I think they're missing the boat. And still today, I talk with refiners and I say, are you interested in being able to do things that would allow you to survive price spikes like we're seeing right now in Chicago? No, they're not really. I don't think they will until a bandwagon starts, and then the dominoes will start to fall and people say, hey,
right.
The guys who can make gasoline right now, the guys in the Midwest who can make a lot of good tier 3 gasoline, watch their earnings reports in the third quarter. Okay. I've said that there's an old saying that says when the tide goes out, that's when you find out who's been swimming naked. You probably heard that one.
Yeah, I have. Yes, I have.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what happens in the winter. Butane covers over everything. When you can't put butane in the gasoline in the summer, that's when you'd separate the men from the boys.
Yeah.
And the boys are the ones, not necessarily the ones who have problems like Joliet, but the ones who can't respond when there's a demand for gasoline and they can make a good margin on it and they can say, turn the dials and we'll make that gasoline. Those are the guys that are making the big money.
Now, maybe you have a little bit more information about this. I have brought this up on this program more than once. Patrick probably automatically knows what I'm getting ready to say, but we're talking about reformulated gasoline just a little bit here. Most folks don't realize that there is a large spread or difference in some of the reformulated gas. There's multiple versions of reformulated gasoline is a better way of putting it across the country. For the life of me, I do not understand why we just simply cannot create, and maybe there is a magic ball answer here that you're about to blow my mind with, and I hope so. But why on earth do we have such a piecemealed version of this reformulated gasoline that, quite honestly, if I were a refinery, I would be begging the federal government to mandate an across-the-board type of reformulated gasoline. So it's the same reformulated gasoline in Chicago as it is in St. Louis, as it is wherever. And the other argument that I have made is I recognize that we have multiple areas. Like Patrick's got the map up right now. I'm looking at the St. Louis metro area right now, the Chicago area.
And this is just, it's been even more complex than this in the past. So, let's look at this.
So the major question that I have is, what difference does it make if the tailpipe is driving down the road in Montana versus in downtown Chicago or St. Louis? If the EPA is truly about cleaner air, why not just make it easier for refineries and say, listen, from XYZ date until this date, and we recognize there's a temperature sensitivity in reformulated gasoline. It has to warm up. So there's going to have to be that gradual process from basically south to north in our country. But why are there so many different versions of reformulated gasoline, and why are we just not across the board in the summer months? I would have to think refineries would not only rejoice at that, but everyone would rejoice at that, simply because it's much easier at this point to deal with situations like what we are seeing, in different.
We don't need waivers if we're all using.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, help the poor person like me understand this process, because it has really, I mean, Patrick can tell you, I lost my cool on a program a few episodes ago. I'm like, I can't take this anymore.
The vein started sticking out.
The vein in the middle of my forehead that I didn't even know existed started popping out. So talk to us about that. Why is it like this?
Okay, well, I would say there's one big division that I think you need to make, and that's cities versus non-cities. Okay, so if you look at like Los Angeles, they really had a bad problem with smog and ozone and very, very bad air quality until these reformulated fuels came along, and that's because of the high concentration of exhaust that comes in a city area. And one of the big aspects, which we haven't talked about much, is volatility. But when the gasoline is volatile, a lot of hydrocarbons vaporize right out of the gasoline into the air. And that's a local problem. Whereas if you're driving through the middle of Montana, that's just you dispersing it in your car. Okay. So that's a good reason why cities need to have different specs, especially in the summer, than other parts of the country. And the reason the summer is important is because that's when the volatility is highest, and you'll get more hydrocarbons in the air. Now, as to why we say such a proliferation of reformulated gasolines, I think that's kind of like, do you see why it is that people in California would want to be more stringent in their regulations than somebody in Des Moines, Iowa? Okay, so to the extent that locals get an opportunity to specify what they prefer, somebody in a farm rural community in Iowa would say, I don't want to use the expensive gasoline they need in LA.
Right.
Okay, so there is it's kind of an artifact of the fact that these specifications can't totally be driven from the federal level. There are local and state impacts on them that lead to proliferation. My own belief is that I think you could probably have 2 or at most 3 different grades of summer gasoline. And
even that would be helpful compared to what currently exists on the map, because Patrick, correct me if I'm wrong, but even in the St. Louis metro area, the Illinois side of the St. Louis metro area operates under a different version of reformulated gasoline than the Missouri side of the same metro area. Am I wrong about that? I believe that's the case.
All the same, right, George?
I'm not really sure, but I know there are some very, very, very local differences in different parts of the country that, as Matt says, really just don't make any sense.
Matt, I think there used to be a difference between St. Louis and Chicago. Those two metro areas. One was northern RFG, the other one was southern, which, again, to George, a lot of these, folks in Montana may not want to pay the extra, 20 cents a gallon of that special blend in California. So I can see why, get out of here. We don't need this kind of thing. Although I do think that if you made one blanket requirement, it probably over time would improve in cost differential. But yeah, talk to us a little bit, George, too. One thing Matt and I have often talked about till we're blue in the face is that difference between summer and winter. And that's probably one of the biggest questions every summer, every spring we get is what, people aren't aware of this, right? The Clean Air Act and what it did. Why is there a difference? What's the difference? You mentioned butane a couple minutes ago. We've talked about octane. What we probably haven't spoken a lot about is naphtha either. A lot of people probably don't know what that is. So talk to us a little bit on how all of that mixes together to create this summer gasoline concoction, and why is it more expensive than winter gasoline?
Okay, well, the biggest thing is that butane is an abundant, very low sulfur, cheap, high octane gasoline blend stock. And you would love to use butane all year long, but you can't, because in the summertime it's too volatile and it evaporates and hangs in the air. So in the summertime, the volatility specifications pretty much take butane out of the picture in terms of being able to provide octane to the pool. Okay. And like I said, butane is kind of like the ocean that covers everything over. You do that, it fixes everything. It hides what's underneath. In the summertime, when you can't put butane in, then the refineries have to work a lot harder to meet the octane specifications. Okay. And so those summertime reformulated gasoline formulations, you can think of it in terms of a volatility specification that cuts out a big source of octane, which is butane. And that octane is more and more important every year. So in the summertime, these octane shortages, local octane shortages, every time you have a hiccup in a refinery, the price of gasoline goes up. There's a lot more to the reformulated gasoline than that, but I think what happened, and then you mentioned naphtha, especially with the fracking and the production of crude oils in the US. We're producing a lot of naphtha that is good gasoline, except for the fact that it's real low octane. Okay. And when it's such low octane, an abundance of it becomes a liability. And if you don't have the octane barrels to be able to boost its octane to make gasoline out of it, it becomes a problem. So we have a problem with naphtha, and they call it crapta, which is a good name for it because it looks great. It's like gasoline, but when you look at it, you can't do anything with it unless you got a lot of expensive
low octane, right?
Right. It becomes a liability. You find a way to get rid of it. So that's all part of an octane issue that is not discussed much and resides below the surface of the macro discussion about refining capabilities in terms of our ability to produce the gasoline we need in the U.S. And we're importing more gasoline. We're importing gasoline. California is importing gasoline and octane from Far East. And on the East Coast, we're importing a lot. We import a lot of alkylate from India. Well, that means India is doing our refining for us. Okay. It'd be a lot better if we didn't destroy our own octane, which is what we're doing when we desulfurize gasoline. So that's kind of the whole octane picture. Butane explains a lot of it. As soon as refiners can start putting butane in September, these price spikes might happen, but they won't be anywhere near as extreme.
Hey, that's certainly very fascinating. I wanted to touch on Dangote Refinery in Nigeria. For those that don't know, we've talked about that a little bit on this program too. They were supposed to be operational, a year and a half ago. Some of these, and by the way, not all the global specifications for fuels are the same. The US and Europe are very clean markets, as well as Australia, Japan. Brand new refineries do have a difficult time in ramping up production of these very clean spec fuels. Is that right, George?
Yeah, they do. And people are rightly skeptical of their claims in terms of when they're going to be producing what. From what I hear, it is certainly the case that the Dangote refinery in Africa is up and running and is processing, I think, 300,000 plus barrels of crude. But again, where do they stand on their ability to produce products that are marketable in the markets that they want to sell to, like Europe, I don't think they've got very far, if anywhere, in being able to produce products that actually compete against the fuels of the West.
Well, George, I really thank you for your time today. I know that I have learned a ton.
Yeah.
And I have so many more questions, like why did we ever think lead was healthy to put in gas and all these other things. We'll have to do a part 2 sometime soon because there's so many other questions there that we just, wow. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Again, follow him, Big Shorty George on Twitter, George Hoekstra over on LinkedIn. And for us over a barrel, you can always follow us as well over a barrel show on Twitter and Facebook. You tune in on Spotify, and those that listen on Spotify, you can also tune in on YouTube now where we have video of all three of us. Maybe that might scare you away, but hopefully not. Check us out just about anywhere. Throw us a like and follow. Again, George, on behalf of Matt and I, really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, guys. My pleasure. Hope to see you again soon.
Absolutely. And we'll talk again soon.